This will be the first of several videos in a series that covers the ancient history of intelligent life on Earth prior to the current root race. The idea of rounds and root races is nothing new. While many New Age mystics and philosophers have written on the idea for over the past 150 years, the concept has been part of Hinduism for millennia. It is the notion that Earth goes through population cycles, where new races are seeded on Earth every so many tens of thousands of years, and they are eventually destroyed by great natural cataclysms or by their own destructive tendencies. According to this esoteric history, the current species we call human is not necessarily the smartest, most technologically advanced, or even the most genetically superior race to have walked this Earth. Root races have 7 sub-races, or various groups of people with varying ethnicities that start their civilizations at various points on the globe. Over the course of these 7 sub-races, a root race will go through 4 ages, or periods of varying peace, well-being, and prosperity. In the Hindu religion, ages are referred to as yuga. Races start off in their golden age, where abundance and kindness reign supreme. There are no borders or wars, and people live in harmony with the earth. The Silver Age follows, which is just a slightly diluted version of the Golden Age. During the Copper Age, wars begin, and borders are formed. People attempt to own land, and egotism takes root. The last age is the Iron Age, where war, strife, and destruction are abound. Earth's first root race, the Polarians, sometimes referred to as the protoplasmic race, are perhaps the race most different from modern humans. This race was formed on an island at the modern-day North Pole. They were a semi-ethereal race, meaning that their bodies were more energetic than physical. The Polarians had complete control over their physical appearance. If they liked the shape of an animal they saw, they would assume that shape for a time. According to Aztec lore, they were extraordinary dark-colored giants. According to H.P. Blavatsky, they were so ethereal and so little human in constitution, they could not be affected by any elements, flood or fire. They had no need of solid food, for they drew in their vitality from the atmosphere and could travel effortlessly by mind power, directed by wish fulfillment alone. Polarians did not have a spoken or written language. It was unnecessary for them, as they were a completely telepathic race. Any being could read another being's mind. The Polarians were an inquisitive race, and they wanted to learn everything they could about the world around them, other Polarians, as well as understand themselves completely. Little is mentioned in the literature about the separation between the divisions of the Polarian race's sub-races or ages, although it is mentioned that the Polarians gradually became slightly less ethereal and slightly more physical as they began to imitate other animals within nature. They did not fight any wars, as they were an ethically superior race, especially when compared to the current root race. An emotionally damaging betrayal was the worst act any Polarian would commit, even in their Iron Age. Polarians reproduced asexually, similar to the manner that single-cell organisms divide. The parent would produce all the necessary material for the new being inside themselves, then would divide in two, and the child would stay attached to the parent for a time until it was strong enough to exist as an independent body. The individuals of this race did not die. Instead, they melted gradually away, becoming absorbed in the bodies of their own sweat-born progeny, the next root race, the Hyperboreans, a new race with bodies more solid than their own. So the Polarians were not destroyed by cataclysm. They were essentially perfect beings that could live indefinitely, and their lives only ended when the time allotted to their root race was finished. and even still, some stayed behind to help along the Hyperboreans. Those who did not gave all their energy to produce the next root race. In lore, it has also been said in a metaphorical sense that the Polarians were devoured by the tigers of wisdom. The goal of the Polarian root race was to develop intelligence and compassion within their genome to pass down to future root races, a goal which they accomplished admirably. The search for the fabled continent of Hyperborea has been an elusive mystery in its own right, almost like a far more rarely mentioned version of the Atlantis myth. Hyperborea translates into English as beyond the north wind. It was often referred to as the land of eternal sun. Greek philosophers and historians hypothesized that it could be found somewhere in Thrace, Dacia, or somewhere just north of those regions. They believed that the god Apollo considered Hyperborea to be his winter home. In truth, a large portion of Hyperborea no longer existed by the time of ancient Greece. Much of it was destroyed in the cataclysm that ended the Hyperborean era. Modern-day Greenland, Iceland, as well as parts of Europe and Russia were once part of Hyperborea, or part of the many large islands or island continents that surrounded the main continent. The British Isles were also part of Hyperborea, although the British Isles have sunk and risen multiple times over the course of Earth's history. The Hyperboreans, like their Polarian ancestors, communicated telepathically. Even though they were bipedal and shaped far differently, Hyperboreans did not necessarily register themselves mentally as being different from the Polarians at the start of the Hyperborean race's reign. A certain period of time is allotted to land that arises on the Earth, and it is the same amount of time that the inhabitants of that land have to make use of their time in the world. The Polarians were an exceptional race, and were not subjected to a cataclysm, but their children, the Hyperboreans, were born on Polarian land, which had run out of time in the cosmic scheme. The Hyperborean continent rose out of the waters, and the Polarian island became plagued by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and toxic gases released from the Earth. While the Polarians were completely non-physical, the Hyperboreans gradually became more physical. They lost the Polarians' imperviousness to nature. While they still couldn't drown in water, they could be burnt by fire. They were now beginning to be subjected to the harsh conditions of the elements, and they suffered in that loss. Hyperboreans needed to eat food. In exchange, the Hyperboreans had much more vivid sensory perceptions than their Polarian ancestors. Although the notion that sensory perceptions could be either pleasurable or painful was a new concept. Their skin was blue in color. While the Polarians were technically larger, they had the ability to augment their size and shape down to the size of a geometric point. The Hyperboreans stood on average 120 feet tall. The bodies of the Hyperboreans reproduced by budding, as is the case with some modern-day plants. New Hyperboreans would grow off the bodies of their parent. The notion of having a family tree is a remnant of this time in humanity's history. Just like the Polarians, the Hyperboreans did not have a division of sexes. All material required to produce new life was held within one being. The Hyperboreans did not have a strong mental faculty of intellectual reasoning. Instead, they had superior intuitive imaginations that could perceive the truth of the universe. As with the Polarians, little is mentioned of the Hyperborean subraces or the division of the Four Ages. The savior of the Hyperboreans was Quetzalcoatl, whose story passed down to the Aztecs and Mayans. The Hyperboreans were primarily nomadic. This was a necessity as the toxic gases released by the old Polarian lands clouded the atmosphere. Whenever the air in a region became unbreathable, they packed up their belongings and moved. The Hyperboreans succeeded in developing courage against their harsh environmental conditions. but failed in maintaining the universal compassion the Polarians expressed. As time went by, each new generation in turn encountered fresh difficulties to be solved, as their ties to physicality strengthened. There was also sudden threats to the well-being and safety of their settlements from natural causes, for the planet's crust remained unstable following the cataclysms which brought the Polarian Age to a close. Gradually, their ideal of controlling and experiencing the empathetic sense as an exploratory skill was supplanted by a lack of sympathy, which would come to be considered the norm, and sadly, in their zeal to overcome attachment, their goal of non-attachment would become confused and be replaced by a hardness of heart, which, by the end of the Hyperborean Age, came to represent a virtue in their eyes. In their final days, Hyperboreans valued their own survival over helping others. After the end of the Hyperborean era, plants were brought to this planet that would adequately clear the atmosphere of the toxic gases that escaped the Earth. The Hyperboreans who did not repent and eliminate their hardness of heart were eliminated by powerful hurricanes. Some degenerates of the Hyperborean race managed to escape the cataclysm. Over the course of countless generations, they became a variety of simian species. Those who did not succumb to these pitfalls became the Nordics of the present root race. The Lemurians existed on the continent of Mu in the time between the Hyperborean and Atlantean epoch. Based on the writings of William Scott Elliott, Santiago Bovicio, and Valerie Bonwick, the timeline of the Lemurian race's existence is difficult to calculate with exactitude, though it probably began anywhere from 6 to 30 million years ago and ended anywhere from 1 to 2 million years ago. It is far from a perfect time. While the race started in a near utopia, mistakes were made on the parts of both the Lemurians as well as those overseeing the development of their race. One description of Lemurian physique is as follows. Their skin was very dark, being of a yellowish-brown color. They had a long lower jaw, a strangely flattened face, small eyes but piercing, and set curiously far apart, so that they could see sideways as well as in front. While the eye at the back of the head, on which part of the head had no hair, enabled them to see in that direction also. They had no forehead, but there seemed to be a roll of flesh where it should have been. The head sloped backwards and upwards in a rather curious way. The arms and legs, especially the former, were longer in proportion than ours, and could not be perfectly straightened either at elbows or knees. The hands and feet were enormous, and the heels projected backwards in an ungainly way. We do not need to wonder what the Lemurians looked like, however, for there are remnants of their civilization still present in certain select parts of the Earth. The statues on Easter Isle are sculptures of Lemurians. Whether the Earth kept these statues safe, or they were protected for future generations by outside entities, is up for debate. Early Lemurians stood around 60 feet tall, though their height gradually decreased across the ages, and later Lemurians stood between 12 and 15 feet tall. The average Lemurian lived to be over 1,000 years old. In their original state, Lemurians had such well-developed capacities that their eyes could distinguish more than 1.5 million tonalities of color. In modern humanity, some people are plagued with color blindness and have difficulty seeing even the basic 7 distinctions of the solar prism. The Lemurians also had a third eye on the back of their head, as previously mentioned, that was fully clairvoyant, that allowed them to communicate telepathically. This eye later atrophied and became the pineal gland of later generations. With the atrophy of that third eye, the need for vocal communication became a necessity, and one of the goals of the Lemurian race was to develop the creative powers of sound, although for a time in the race's history they had both telepathic and vocal communication. Most dark-skinned races of the present era are said to descend from the people of Lemuria, and if you look at the theosophic maps of Lemuria, you can see outlined in red that the continent of Mu stretched from the region of modern-day Africa and covered Australia, both places inhabited by dark-skinned natives during the modern epoch. Another subcontinent of Mu extends from the southern tip of South America well into the Pacific Ocean and covers the area where modern-day Easter Island is located. Initially, Lemurian people were hermaphroditic, meaning they contained complete male and female reproductive organs within their bodies. The Lemurians of the first three subraces could reproduce on their own, and when they did, they would lay eggs that had to be incubated for a period of time. Later subraces, starting with the fourth, would eventually reproduce as we do today, with two distinct sexes, requiring cooperation in order to engender a child. At some point in the Lemurian timeline, between the third and fourth subraces, estimated by Valerie Bonwick to be somewhere around 16.5 million years ago, the hermaphroditic Lemurians laid eggs that contained children that were either male or female, and reproduction continued for them as it does for us today. The physical differences between the sexes was not initially obvious, and their external appearance remained the same for quite some time. Gradually, internal physical adjustments established themselves. Male and female qualities of expression became more pronounced. The transformation which resulted in the division of the sexes could not and did not happen overnight. It was such a gradual process that it came to be looked upon by the Lemurians as unremarkable. Lemurian speech patterns developed gracefully, with an infinite variety of inflection, but it was not until the latter days of the Lemurian Empire that the written word became common in everyday use. By that time, writing had also achieved high artistic merit, and because it attempted to express their complex musical speech patterns in script, their written word was also complex and inclined to pattern itself after natural plant growth, like the vines which were useful in so many areas of their everyday life. It was well after the division of the sexes that wearing clothes took on any importance. In the beginning, it was only those who held some position of authority in the community who adorned themselves with decoration or covered themselves, and it was a practice which began as a visible sign of the office of leader. When they began to experiment with flax, weaving became an art form in and of itself, and this also resulted in an upsurge of original design. A relaxed and measured pace of life was the norm for most Lemurians, which is probably why the race evolved so slowly. Their lives were quite untroubled until the late Lemurian age, and therefore hardship was either avoidable or kept to the minimum. Lemurians had no need of complex structures for their everyday requirements, but they did become deeply involved in the creation of impressive public buildings. They had already to some extent mastered climate control, even if it was very local and on a small scale. So they needed little protection from the elements. Therefore, they chose to erect superb, monumental structures that were instrumental in establishing a sense of security, furthering social interaction, promoting group affiliation, and providing a defined sense of community. Lemurians had already learned to harness telekinetic power, and their use of it in construction was supported by direction and guidance they received from their rulers. Their priest kings possessed extremely sophisticated planning abilities, as they were likely either taught by extraterrestrial entities or were extraterrestrials themselves. Lemurians were quick to emulate the massive architecture of their extraterrestrial mentors. Late Lemurian temples in particular became even more cyclopean in size. Flying ships and powered watercraft became very much a part of everyday Lemuria. Unlike the craft of extraterrestrials, they were simple in design and used purely for pleasure and not intended to transport heavy weights, although they did come into permanent use as a means of frequent visits between the colonies in the days of the Lemurian Empire. Travel on water had always seemed natural to the Lemurians, perhaps as a throwback to earlier stages of being when it was impossible for man to drown. It was not until the sinking of the continent of Atlantis and the submergence of the remaining large islands much later that mankind registered a fear of drowning. Problems for the Lemurian race began primarily due to oversights on the part of the higher intelligences overseeing the development of the Lemurian root race. These occurred just prior to the division of the sexes. The first error occurred when the comet Condor collided with the Earth, completely destabilizing the Earth's geological layers. Powerful earthquakes and tsunamis raged across the surface of the Earth, which threatened to destroy the Lemurian race. Around the same time, the beings of Lemuria were becoming increasingly worried about the reason for their existence. They were a highly perceptive race, with insights into higher dimensions, and they could see that their race had no potential for spiritual advancement in its current condition. In short, their existence at that time served no purpose other than to be stewards of the Earth and later die. This depressed the Lemurian people and brought them on the verge of a mass suicide. In order to fix these problems, the beings in oversight of the Lemurian epoch implanted an organ into the base of the Lemurian spines. This organ is known as the Kundabuffer. The Kundabuffer organ served three functions. The first was to stop the Lemurian race from committing mass suicide. It created in them an intense fascination with the material world, with sensations. Everything they received from taste, touch, sound, sight, and smell became more pleasurable. This preoccupied them so that they enjoyed existence and were no longer depressed by a lack of purpose. The organ's second function had to do with the stabilization of the Earth's core. The energy produced by the Kundabuffer organ within all members of the Lemurian race was capable of neutralizing the intense earthquakes caused by the impact. The third function of the Kundabuffer organ is related to the first. Once the Kundabuffer organ is removed, it allows for spiritual development, although spiritual development can be both positive and negative. Those overseeing the Lemurian race made another miscalculation, however, and left the organ in for too long while attempting to restabilize the surface of the planet. This caused the Lemurians to become too attached to the material world. The organ was removed, but its after effects remained. The coccyx, or tailbone, of modern humanity is a remnant of the Kundabuffer organ, which has given the later Lemurians, as well as the Atlanteans and the modern Aryan race, a propensity to obsess over physical stimulation and material possessions. The shadow of this organ has also led these races towards a propensity for black magic. The early Lemurians followed the wise guidance of their priest kings. Their goal of using vocal power for creative purposes was realized in the form of mantra yoga, and some of these vocalization techniques have been passed down in various religions of the modern era. The Lemurians could also tame animals with vocalizations. Some of this reaches the modern era in a rudimentary form through snake charmers and other practitioners who use music to produce various effects. At the height of their proficiency, the Lemurians could manipulate various species of the animal kingdom and control the winds and waves of the ocean. Certain leaders, who had mastered the practice of mantra yoga, developed a technique of conserving and accumulating energy, which is produced by charging the atmosphere with sound, vibration, echo, and reverberation. A technique now lost, it was a system which intensified the projection of sound waves based upon the concentration of specific harmonic patterns. The technique was originally used to harness energy for the furtherance of community projects. Energy was generated, converted, accumulated, and transferred for storage to natural caverns underneath temples until it was needed. They had given a great deal of thought to the problem of storing this energy because they were unsure of its properties or stability. Some of the choral experiments reached heightened intensity that demanded the results remain within thickly insulated walls, rather than have its impact unintentionally influence or shatter the diverse forms of non-participants. The practitioners of these mysteries who generated and served as conductors of these energies were protected from harmful effects by various means, including a self-induced trance-like state. For better or worse, ritualism and superstition had made inroads into their culture. Some later Lemurians began using vocalization to harm their fellow Lemurians, as their practices began to tend towards black magic. Later Lemurians became competitive. While this was initially harmless, and led the Lemurians to a greater degree of honest work in an otherwise lax society, it later resulted in an intense effort to control one's fellow man. This effort to acquire power was spearheaded by the leaders of less important but more pretentious family clans, their scions, or sometimes an ambitious relative who had received some training in the black arts. They forgot that in order to rule successfully after gaining power, one must maintain a balance of control by imposing requisite and voluntary limitation upon one's personal ambitions. The power skills they employed included a form of mantric practice, which endowed the practitioner with some control over the elements. A few skilled practitioners bonded nature spirits to themselves, as well as members of the animal kingdom. These powers had not been used harmfully in the past when directed sparingly or unselfishly. They were used positively for the protection of one's animal friends from the elements by deflecting the wrath of a storm or invoking elemental allies to help members of the community. This involved only positive thought and nothing that was counter to the integrity or against the will of those involved. The practice of using these skills to outdo or outwit one's peers soon acquired an ugly character. The prize they sought was not a trophy or personal honor, but to acquire ascendancy over their neighbors, control those who disagreed with them, or enslave some of those whom they envied. The foundation of several hypnotic techniques owe something of their inception to this dark period in Lemurian history. The Great White Magician initiates at this time established a branch of the hierarchy for those purely earthborn to provide training related to solving mankind's problems. Well-tested Lemurians were encouraged to train for entrance into that lodge called the Great White Brotherhood, although it would be quite some time before they would advance to fill positions of authority held by the Great Initiates. Those Great Initiates also founded the first schools of enlightenment, to which all who proved worthy were welcome. Later on, young Lemurians whose level of spiritual understanding had degenerated became tempted by illusory promises of power, which surely originated from their own imagination. When they applied and failed to meet the spiritual criteria required for acceptance into the Brotherhood, they speedily confirmed their unworthiness to an entrance into any hallowed place by joining forces in an attempt to overpower their spiritual superiors. Stress mounted, the populace took sides, and the spiritual rift deepened. Many teachers left Lemuria at this time to establish centers of pure learning elsewhere, based upon spiritual integrity. The atmosphere created by the practices of the black magicians was suffocating. They influenced the greedy segment of the populace to oppose supporters of the White Lodge. The emigration of the white magicians and their families was not a form of surrender or escape. They mounted a positive movement in the latter days to block further deterioration of Lemurian values and character, by creating their own force field of energies as a barrier against the projection of the dark side of magic. Until that time, the majority of Lemurians had presented a solid defense by blocking offensive negativity, but the drain upon their vitality and the constant anxiety of maintaining a defensive attitude was one of which prevented anyone from making positive progress in any other field of endeavor. They were harassed day after day by marauding animal and insect life manipulated by adepts of the left-handed path, against which one needed a constant vigilance. They fought constant battle against blight on their crops, introduced by the Brothers of the Shadow, who enslaved and controlled nature spirits. They lived in constant threat from the elements. Their loved ones could literally be struck by lightning if they relaxed their protective skills, and the oceans would be whipped into a frenzy within minutes, sweeping them away if they were not encompassed by a protective shield when venturing out on the water. As with all root races, the Lemurian era eventually came to a close. Once the race's time was up, great volcanic eruptions and earthquakes overtook the continents of Lemuria and its surrounding islands. The vast majority met their end by fire or by suffocation. It is known that some survivors of the 7th subrace of the Lemurians intermarried with the first subrace of the Atlanteans. In the latter stages of the Lemurian epoch, the Lemurians had become so attached to their lust that they started to reproduce with degenerated beings from the previous epochs. These degenerated beings appeared human to the Lemurians, but had the intellect of animals. It is said the offspring of these relationships eventually became the modern human race. Regarding Atlantis, there are far too many authors who claim to know its fate and its history. The vast majority of them, when writing on Atlantis, are fabricating stories, or at the very least highly misinformed. As such, I've only included information in this video from authors whose accounts were backed up by at least one other author. Both Valerie Bonwick and W. Scott Elliott placed the start of the Atlantean root race at around 2 million years ago. If you have watched the previous video on root races, you will notice that the time for the existence of each root race has been shrinking. The Lemurian root race lasted close to 12 million years, but the Atlanteans only lasted for at most 2 million. This can in part be explained by the average life expectancy of the members of each race. Lemurians could potentially live for over 1,000 years. The average Atlantean lived for 300 years. Races have also been shrinking in stature, precisely halved for each new root race. Hyperboreans were roughly 120 feet tall, Lemurians 60 feet, Atlanteans 30 feet. While different Atlantean subraces varied to some extent, the average Atlantean had tan or olive skin color, especially in the latter days of Atlantis. Like the latter-day Lemurians, Atlanteans reproduced as we do today. W. Scott Elliott claims that all aspects of matter and the atmosphere were less dense during the Atlantean epoch. This caused fires to burn taller, planes to glide across the air with ease, and ships to be more buoyant. Samuel Onweor has said that the atmosphere during this time was much different. Geothermal activity near the surface of the ocean floor was at an all-time high, causing large quantities of water vapor to steam off the surface of oceans all across the world. The atmosphere was so infused with water that early Atlanteans prior to the first flood had an organ similar to gills in order to survive breathing on the surface. These gills developed into lungs after the first flood. According to both Valerie Bonwick and Gurdjieff, many off-planet entities made Earth their home during the early days of the Atlantean root race, in particular, beings from the planet Mars. According to W. Scott Elliott, the early subraces of the Atlantean root race did not have the highly developed capacity for logical reasoning that we have today. The potential for advanced mathematical calculation and processing of logical syllogisms was something that had to develop within the minds of the Atlanteans during this period, and continued much further during the present root race. What the early Atlanteans lacked in reasoning, they made up for with an impeccable memory. An Atlantean would be able to remember at once every experience they had throughout the course of their lifetime. Rather than trying to figure out new solutions to the problems they encountered, they would consider how similar situations had worked out in the past. They would then apply those old experiences to present situations. Advanced theorizing about possibilities was out of the question for them, but they made up for this with an immense curiosity and willingness to experiment. Experimentation was seen as a way of acquiring new experience. In short, Atlanteans couldn't make a hypothesis, but were capable of saying, "I wonder what will happen when I do this," and then learning from the experience. Atlantean technological progress was much slower than our own, but reached higher heights even during the early parts of their root race's existence due to the immense amount of time given to their race. It is also likely that they had fewer setbacks or dark ages. Imagine what would have happened to our race if the Middle Ages had Rome's running water, or if the library at Alexandria had not been destroyed. Regardless, learning many things did not matter as much to the Atlanteans as having a great deal of experience. Atlantean elders were revered for having lived through so much. The first 4 sub-races of the Atlantean root race also had another distinct advantage. While their use of mental energy was not fully developed, they had an immense capacity for interacting with raw natural life force energy. This gave them the ability to commune with and control the elemental spirits of nature. During the first 3 sub-races, this ability was used mostly for benevolent means, but during the 4th, it took a much darker turn. Thanks largely in part to the writings of W. Scott Elliott, Helena P. Blavatsky, Samuel Onweor, and to a lesser extent Gurdjieff, we still have accurate details of the 7 Atlantean subraces and approximate times for the 4 Atlantean ages. I wanted to include a section on this in the video for the Lemurians, but every source I encountered disagreed on the names and history of the Lemurian subraces, so it is safe to say that that information has been lost to time. Thankfully, the knowledge of the Atlantean subraces is still for the most part well intact. There are some disagreements, but for the most part it isn't too difficult to come to a general consensus. The R'mwahls are the first subrace of the Atlantean root race. I will put spellings of these names in the video description. They started on a small island near the main body of the early Atlantean continent, demarcated by the number 1. This land is what survived the destruction of Lemuria. The R'mwahls were a mixture of beings brought to Earth for the start of a new race, and the best survivors of the old Lemurian race. Since the Lemurians were a primarily dark-skinned people, the R'mwahls had a much darker complexion than the other Atlantean subraces. They reached their height during Atlantis' Golden Age, meaning that greed, strife, and war were unheard of. They lived in a utopian monarchical society. They worshipped the sun, and they had an extreme reverence for the dead. Ancestors were not worshipped, but they were highly esteemed. The R'mwahls were more nomadic than the other subraces, and lived simple lives very close to the earth. While the R'mwahl people called their leaders kings, they were more like tribal chiefs of a dignified people. During later epochs, the remnants of the R'mwahl people did engage in wars with the 6th and 7th root races, as their people were often pushed aside when new subraces came into prominence in the regions the latter-day R'mwahls were occupying. The Tlavatlis were the 2nd subrace. They began their era of prominence in Atlantis' Golden Age, and ended their prominence during the beginning of the Silver Age. They initially lived on the island marked by the number 2 on the map west of the main Atlantean continent, although later during their prominence settled on the mainland. While there, they preferred to live in the more mountainous regions of the continent, both during and after their time of prominence. Their skin color was a reddish-brown, and they were an exceptionally strong and hardy people. These Atlanteans developed some of the most advanced technology of this root race. They were in contact with extraterrestrial entities and developed cosmic ships that utilized atomic energy. The Toltecs were the 3rd Atlantean subrace, and reigned during the latter half of the Silver Age and into the Copper Age. They started out at the point demarcated by the number 3 on the map. Since it was no longer the Golden Age, the Toltecs did encounter some troubles. As mentioned in previous videos on root races, borders and wars do not exist prior to a root race's Copper Age, but some societal issues did occur for the Toltecs. One mistake the Toltecs made was introducing the notion of hierarchical succession. Prior to the Toltecs, all kings over tribes or kingdoms chose the wisest among them to be their leader. the Toltecs began the practice of honoring people for the deeds of their ancestors. So bloodline succession became the norm, even if the successor was unfit to rule. Like the Tlavatlis, the Toltecs had reddish-brown skin color, and they also had rather persistent genetics. Later on, when the Toltecs intermarried with people of future and previous subraces, the children would still look mostly Toltec. The word Toltec means builder or mason, and it was the Toltecs who primarily cultivated the practice of building pyramids. They created large cities, and at their height spanned the entirety of the Atlantean continent for thousands of years. The Ramuahals and Tlavatlis, being sensible and peaceful at this time, simply moved out of the way for the Toltecs. They saw that the Toltec civilization was flourishing, and for the most part gave way to allow them to progress. The Ramuahals kept moving as they were a nomadic people anyway, and the Tlavatlis stayed in the mountainous region since they preferred it there, while the Toltecs preferred flat expanses of land on which to build their cities. The Toltecs were the ones who built the famous city of the Golden Gates. The city was so well constructed and maintained that it lasted thousands of years, until Atlantis started flooding. Some have claimed this city stood until the final sinking of Atlantis. In actuality, there were a total of 7 cities of the Golden Gates, built at various locations across the continent during the Toltecs' reign of dominance. The Toltecs are still remembered in the mythologies of native people in Central America. Quetzalcoatl, who is remembered in mythological form as a feathered serpent, was actually a leader and savior of the Toltec people. Subraces past the Toltecs tended to have a more tan skin color. Many people of both the Toltec and the Tlavatli races fled to the Americas as those lands became available. The Turanians were the 4th root race. The Turanians had their start in the area demarcated by the number 4 on the eastern side of the continent, just south of the mountainous region inhabited by the Tlavatlis at this time. The dates on the end of the Copper Age are unclear, but one thing is certain: the Turanians ushered in the Iron Age, or Kali Yuga, as it is referred to in Hindu traditions. They were by far and away the worst of all the Atlantean subraces. As one author put it, they were especially vile in their abominable selfishness. They erected temples where the kings were worshipped as gods, and caused the extreme oppression of the helpless lower classes. Black magic of the worst and most nauseating kind flourished, and all their efforts were directed towards the gratification of vanity and external display. So not the friendliest of neighbors. Some of the best Turanian cities were the ones they captured from the Toltecs. They never really took over the entirety of the continent of Atlantis as the Toltecs did, partly due to fracturing in their power structures as various rulers sought to keep more power for themselves, partly due to the formidability of the Toltecs. The Turanians, and those people of other subraces who followed in their practices, did control the entirety of the island of Atlantis in its latter days, after it had shrunk considerably in size. At this time, the first of 4 major flooding events took place on the continent of Atlantis, and this is sometime around 800,000 BC. This cataclysm took place after a great war between white and black magicians. I detailed the battle between the white master Moria and the black master Orhuarpa in the Black Magicians of Atlantis video. Now, with each of these flooding events, land sinks away from Atlantis. The continent becomes smaller, and lands rise on other continents for new subraces and root races to later inhabit. With each flooding, soil quality decreases, crops do not grow as abundant as they once did, and more land becomes swamp. So those who survived the first flood had much less to work with. Before I switch maps, I want to point out the H that is on an island in what would later become Northern Europe. These are the Hyperboreans. Right now they are leaving Atlantis to handle its own affairs, but they will be coming into play shortly. Alright, so the people of the 4th subrace used their witchcraft and sorcery to hypnotize and control the subjugated masses, as well as the simple-minded people of other races. as I have already detailed all of this there. The Turanian people of Turkey, the Middle East, and Siberia of the modern root race are related to these Turanians, but they are the ancestors of the minority of Turanians who disagreed with the practices of their fellow men on Atlantis, who left at various points during Atlantis' timeline. The Aztecs were also a distant offshoot of the Turanians. While at first their people were a noble race who brought to light many great mysteries, they eventually succumbed to the same pitfalls as their Atlantean ancestors, namely barbarism, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. The Semites, or Shemites, were the fifth subrace of Atlantis. The story of Noah's Ark is part allegory and part history. The historical aspect refers to the story of how the people who would soon become the Shemites left Atlantis after the evils committed by the fourth root race. They had full knowledge of the event before it happened, as it was foretold by many seers. This would perhaps be the best time to mention the Akaldin Society. The Akaldin Society was a mystery school that studied the elemental forces of nature. They were a brotherhood of white magic that began on the island of Atlantis. It is unclear during which subrace they came into being, but it was most likely sometime during the third or fourth subrace's period of dominance. They remained an influential force throughout the remainder of the Atlantean epoch. Notably, they built the Sphinx, and maintained the knowledge of pyramid building for the purposes of accumulating positive energy. They were the ones who warned those who deserved to know about the impending floods on Atlantis. At the end of the Atlantean epoch, they passed their knowledge on to the people of Tibet, as well as to the people who would later be known as the Mayans. They also set up the mystery schools of Egypt, which lasted thousands of years and taught the likes of Moses, Pythagoras, and Jesus. The fifth subrace was formed by mixing the blood of Turanians, who had not succumbed to the temptations of black magic, with the descendants of the Hyperboreans, who had kept themselves hidden during the Lemurian epoch. You can see the fifth subrace's starting point at the number 5 on the map. These are the distant ancestors of the modern Jewish people. They mark a major shift according to some authors in the way that people thought. As mentioned earlier, Atlanteans valued memory as the primary mental function. Reasoning and theorizing became a more prominent feature of the Shemite race. Prior to this time, all Atlanteans had the ability to see and communicate with the elemental spirits of nature. Some did this to the great benefit of mankind. For example, a person of the Toltec race could ask an earth elemental where to find gold, or orichalcum to build their temple. Others used elementals for the purposes of great destruction. For example, the Turanians, using their black magic, could force a fire elemental to light a rival village or city on fire. As a consequence for these terrible acts, all people beyond the fourth subrace lost their power to see and interact with elementals as an innate ability, in place of further developed logical reasoning. Now, many people of the fifth, sixth, and seventh subraces regained these lost abilities through the practices taught by the Akaldin Society, but for the most part these abilities were lost to the average person who remained on Atlantis. The Shemites were the polar opposite of the Turanians. At one point, the Shemites forbade their people from intermarrying with the Turanians due to their proclivity towards black magic. The people of the fifth subrace developed a strong sense of conscience. The Shemites had to struggle immensely to undo the damages of the previous subraces, and these struggles are referred to in an allegorical manner in the early books of the Torah and Old Testament. After the second flood, Atlantis had been split into 2 smaller islands, Ruta and Daitya. H.P. Blavatsky is the only author to comment on these islands, stating that the people on them were giants, and for the most part, powerful black magicians. A group existed on these islands known as the Lords of the Dark Face. She also states that some of the people of Ruta were the ones to break off and form Egypt. The sixth subrace is referred to as the Akkadian or Arcadian subrace. In truth, both the Arcadians and Akkadians were part of this subrace. They are just one race that occupied the area around the region that would later become the Mediterranean Sea. People in southern Europe remember them as the Arcadians, and people in the Middle East as the Akkadians. These are not exactly the Akkadians of the ancient world of our modern root race, but the Atlantean Akkadians are the distant ancestors of the Akkadians of the modern era. The people of the sixth subrace are the direct descendants of the fifth subrace. The ancient Greek poet Homer references the Arcadians in the Odyssey. According to him, Arcadia was a land of dryads, nymphs, and other spirits. It was also the home of the god Pan. If we are to take Homer's account seriously, then the Arcadians of the Atlantean root race built a utopia both physically and spiritually for themselves. They were the ancient ancestors of the Greeks. Based on the information given to us by Plato, it is safe to assume that the Arcadians fought against the Turanians at some point, or quite likely at many points in their history, stopping their advance in an attempt to take over the lands that would eventually become Europe and Asia. So the only Iron Age hardships for the Arcadians were the wars caused by the Turanians and other previous subraces. It is possible that some people of the sixth root race were destroyed at some point by the cataclysm that sank Atlantis, and were not warned due to atrocities committed in wartime. The Platonic dialogues at least state that some of the ancient Greeks living in this region were wiped out by flooding. The Mongolians were the seventh subrace. Despite being the most recent of the Atlantean subraces, several authors have rather different takes on their history, or have no history mentioned at all, so it's hard to define much about their existence. They had their start where the number 7 is currently placed on the map. As the ocean in this region receded, these people made their homes on what would later become the Gobi Desert. At this point in Earth's history, that region is a lush forest. The Mongolians were also the direct descendants of the Shemites, though some authors have asserted that they were a mixture of Shemite and Turanian blood. Though this is incorrect, because the decree made by the Shemites that their people were not to mix blood with any of the Turanian people lasted until the end of the Atlantean epoch. These are also the distant ancestors of the modern Mongolian people, as well as the ancestors of most other Eastern Asian peoples. They were the only subrace to have no contact with the continent or island of Atlantis. They were skilled in music, being proficient in the skill of herding and controlling the movement of animals by singing, and this practice has been passed down to the rural Mongolian people of modern times. Much more is known about what became of the seventh subrace of Atlantis, as they will become the foundation for the first subrace of the Aryan root race, and we will discuss that in a later video. The fourth map provided by W. Scott Elliott has a few points of note. After the third flooding in 80,000 BC, Dacia has sunk, and Ruta has shrunk further into the island nation of Poseidonis. This is the land to which Plato refers in his dialogues. Poseidonis was the mountainous region on all previous Atlantis maps, so after the third great flooding period, Atlantis has sunk so far that only the once massive mountainous regions are above sea level. At this point, the Americas are fully developed. There are only two other points of interest on this map. The first is the giant gap in northern Africa. I would think that after the final sinking of Atlantis, this gap closes for the most part, but the Nile River is left well intact as a smaller version of the channel that appears currently on this map. The writings of Edgar Cayce discuss how the Nile used to flow from east to west, flowing into the Atlantic Ocean, and satellite imagery of this region confirmed the existence of a historic waterbed that flows in that direction. The second point of interest is the Himalayas and Plateau of Tibet, or rather, the lack thereof at this time. Prior to the final sinking of Atlantis, this region was first to sea as we saw on the previous map, and then a great lake as we see now. But after the sinking of Poseidonis, this region rises up to become the overall highest region above sea level on the planet. This notion is also supported in the writings of Gurdjieff, who claim that this mountainous region rose up rather suddenly. As far as overall technological progress, Atlanteans used both nuclear and solar technology at their height. Overall, their air and naval crafts were far more impressive than ours. In the modern era, we have nuclear-powered submarines that can remain submerged without needing to refuel. The only concerns in terms of resupplying are making sure the crew has enough food, water, and other provisions. The Atlanteans had nuclear submarines, but also had nuclear-powered aircraft. The Atlanteans also mastered anti-gravity, and with the aid of a small technological device, could render any object weightless. The last days of Atlantis were bleak. Nuclear wars, cannibalism, and dark occultism reigned supreme across the majority of the populace. The descendants of the Turanians had control over the last remaining land on the island of Atlantis, and there were people born of the other sub-races on the island, but they had also fallen in league with the Turanians' depravity, although many people of other races were kept by the Turanians as slaves. Once again, many pieces of Atlantean technology are discussed in the Black Magicians of Atlantis video, so I'll provide an end screen to that at the end of this video. In addition to what is said there, I will add that the Atlanteans had a technological device that could materialize any mental image. It has been said that any well-developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. In this case, an ability that was once reserved for powerful black magicians like Orhuarpa were put into the hands of everyday people. The most perverse Atlanteans would use this device to create demonic monstrosities that they would sustain by feeding their own blood, or the blood of their enemies. It is possible that many of the strange cryptids that are fodder for urban legends all around the world are beings created by this device that survived the final flood. I will also repeat that the science of the late Turanians prior to the final flood was frightfully powerful and destructive. They were able to bind the souls of elementals to machinery in order to create intelligent androids to fight and perform menial labor. These androids looked human, but were powered by an animal level of intelligence. In the previous two videos on the Fear channel, we covered an extensive account of Atlantis' lore. Here we're going to look at the state of the world immediately after Atlantis sank, and how the Atlantean culture and various migrations created a unique set of circumstances in 9564 BC, the year that W. Scott Elliott places the final sinking of Atlantis. All of the major temperate continents of the world are populated at the time Atlantis sank, and have been for many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years by that time. Any tribes of natives living across the entire world are people who have descended from the Lemurians or the Atlanteans. Australia used to be connected to southern Asia and has shrunk considerably over the aeons. I would imagine that the land that became Australia is where the majority of Lemurian survivors ended up fleeing. From the last video, we know that out of the fall of the Atlantean civilization rose up the people of Egypt. The Arcadians were in Europe and the Middle East. The Mongolians were set up in East Asia. The eastern portions of North and South America were once part of the Atlantean continent, and expanded over the course of hundreds of thousands of years as Atlantis sank due to multiple major flooding events. So the Americas have been populated for hundreds of thousands of years. Right now, the commonly accepted theory for how people came to the Americas is that there was a land bridge between Russia and Alaska some 10,000 years ago. Earlier in 2017, archaeologists found a 14,000-year-old village in British Columbia, Canada, proving that people came here by boat. All stories of the universal flood myth relate back to the sinking of the Atlantean continent. The stories of Noah, Vivasvata Manu, the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as the flood myths of all native cultures in the Americas, are mythological remembrances of the floods that sank Atlantis. According to Gurdjieff, many Atlanteans escaped the flood by traveling to a place which was at the time called Pearland, due to the abundance of pearl-containing clams off its shores. Toward the end days of Atlantis, the Atlanteans had become a rather greedy people, obsessed with obtaining, among many things, more pearls. They had farmed clams to near extinction in the waters surrounding Atlantis. Around the time prior to the sinking of Atlantis, Pearland was an Eden-like paradise, with rich soil and plentiful seafood, so many Atlanteans who traveled to the location never left. The Pearland of roughly 10 millennia ago is modern-day India. At its height, Atlantis had canals and land passages that connected Africa to the Americas. At the time, Africa was a much smaller continent, known then as Grabonsi. Africa grew in size tremendously after the Atlantean epic came to an end. As Atlantis sunk beneath the waves, land rose up out of the waters in many places across the world, and Africa was one such land beneficiary. During the time of Atlantis, caravans from northern Grabonsi would travel across the entirety of what is now the Atlantic Ocean to come to the Americas. Olmec statues are one of the primary evidences of this. If you look at a picture of an Olmec, you will see that the faces have characteristically African features. These statues were built in honor of initiates of the mysteries, who traveled across the world to learn and spread knowledge. The banana and the plantain are also evidence of these migrations, since bananas and plantains originally grew in Africa. Thanks almost entirely to the writings of Gurdjieff, we still have a number of words from the Atlantean language, as Gurdjieff uses Atlantean words constantly throughout his book, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. If you are interested in learning fragments of the Atlantean language, I highly suggest you read that book. Heptaparapa Shinnok is a term meaning divine law of 7. This term, along with others that I will be presenting, are complex to say the least, and could have an entire video dedicated to each. So for the sake of brevity, I'll just be giving you the gist of these Atlantean terms. Heptaparapa Shinnok is sometimes referred to as the law of octaves. This law explains how all processes proceed in 7 stages, and eventually end on an 8th stage, which is the start of a new octave from which the process continues forth. Music and color are the best examples of this law in action. Really, anything that vibrates is subject to the process of this law, and since everything vibrates, it is universal. This law is also the reason that planets are given 7 root races before becoming defunct, and why each of those 7 root races have 7 sub-races. Triamazi Kamno is a term meaning divine law of 3. It states that anything that exists consists of 3 parts, namely an active part, a passive part, and a neutral part. It is most easily seen in the construction of atoms and the transference of electricity. Using hept as a suffix for 7 and tri as a suffix for 3 comes directly from the Atlantean language. Poisoniunoskirion is an Atlantean term meaning poisonous energy, a term that I'm sure was used in relation to the actions of the Turanian people often. From it, we derive our modern word for poison. Bobbin candlenasts are another Atlantean concept of note. They are a measurement of life force energy in all living things that is parceled out at birth. When a person runs out of bobbin candlenasts, they die. Beelzebub's Tales goes into detail about how one can conserve their bobbin candlenasts and live a longer, healthier life. From it we get 2 modern words, the word for bobbin in relation to textiles, and the word candle. Bobbins hold a set amount of yarn or thread, and eventually are used up. Likewise, candles hold a set amount of time for their use, determined by the thickness of the wick and the amount of wax. Candles have often been used to reference the duration of a person's life. For an instance of that, you can listen to my recording of Godfather Death by the Brothers Grimm. Now that we've covered some Atlantean words, let's look more into their writing and culture, and how it disseminated into the languages and cultures of today. As mentioned, the Atlanteans built pyramids, and some groups of them wrote in hieroglyphic. Prior to the sinking of Atlantis, some survivors escaped west towards the Americas, while others headed east towards locations in Africa, Europe, and Asia. This is why native tribes in North and South America also built pyramids. While people tend to be more familiar with Mayan pyramids, many are not aware that multiple tribes living prior to the colonization of the United States built pyramids out of wood, silt, and clay. Monk's Mound in Illinois is one such example. This structure was one of many built by the Mississippi tribe. The Mississippi built these pyramids in their cities, and yes, native tribes in North America had cities. The Mississippi tribe developed efficient agricultural techniques and were able to sustain a large population primarily on squash, pumpkins, and green beans. Monk's Mound is the largest of 120 pyramid remnants left behind from the Mississippi city of Cahokia. At its height, Cahokia covered 6 square miles and would have stood a long time had the region not flooded sometime around 1300 AD. The mound is no longer as tall or great a structure as it once was, since the dirt has eroded over the past few centuries. But this and other similar mounds across North America are evidence of native North American pyramid building practices. This connection to Atlantis is also the reason why hieroglyphic writing is found in both Mayan and Egyptian pyramids. The specific symbols used in the two cultures' respective writings are different, and this is probably due to the presence of different flora and fauna between Central America and Egypt, since hieroglyphic writing relies on using animals and plants as symbols. In spite of this, the way the writing is formatted in both cultures is eerily similar, regardless of the potential language evolution that most likely occurred over the course of several thousands of years. The ancient Chinese, as well as other East Asian cultures, also used pyramid structures for their burial tombs that closely resemble the pyramids of Central America. The one pictured is the tomb of the general in Jian, China. Looking more towards written language, the Naji people of China and Tibet, who descended from nomadic tribes living in ancient pre-dynastic China, used a pictographic written language called Dongba, which is similar to hieroglyphics. An Atlantean ancestry could be the reason why so many written languages in Asia have thousands of characters, if the languages evolved from the many symbols used in Atlantean hieroglyphics. According to the works of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the first Atlanteans who practiced black magic began doing so around the end of the third Atlantean subrace's reign. The people of this subrace were known as the Toltecs. They were the ancient ancestors of the native peoples in Central America of the same name. The Toltecs built wondrous cities and great marvels of technology. These Atlanteans began worshipping the dragon Thevatot. Through their practice, the Toltecs became increasingly selfish and materialistic. Soon thereafter, the Turanians, the ancestors of those we now know as the Turkic peoples, became the more dominant fourth subrace, conquering much of Atlantis, frequently battling the Toltecs. The Turanians continued the practice of black magic all the way until the final sinking of Atlantis. Their religion deified the self. The Turanians thought that each person was their own lord, their own god. Shrines would contain gold and silver statues of each member of the village. and people would come to the temple to worship themselves. The rich could have their own shrines and hire priests to offer prayers. Turanians would also worship the other people they admired and pay monetary tribute at their shrines. The Turanians were also a warlike race. They established their military prominence by abandoning family structures altogether. Men were given free rein to impregnate women. These women and their children would be taken care of by the state, and the children would be raised as warriors. These were a people who knew nothing of the bonds of familial love. It was during the periods of the Toltec and Turanian people that the Atlanteans developed a highly evolved knowledge of both magic and science. The Atlanteans powered their cities with nuclear and solar energy. They were no strangers to the power of nuclear weapons. Furthermore, they were capable of infusing elemental spirits into robots, creating intelligent androids. They were also highly skilled in medicine and had mastered transplanting organs. They could even transplant brains, and with them, the conscious awareness of the person to whom that brain belonged. A person could live near indefinitely by transplanting their brain into the body of a younger, fully grown adult. It was during this time period that the great Black Empress Jezebel reigned for hundreds of years over the southern states through glandular infusions. When she sensed her organs were weakening and her body began to age, she would have young women and children killed. Their organs would be collected, and the glandular secretions would be injected into the queen. This process revitalized her, so that she would always appear young and beautiful, free to charm and seduce princes and kings with her malignant beauty. Jezebel was also known for establishing cannibalism in Atlantis. After harvesting organs to rejuvenate herself, she would have her physician priests toss the corpses and unused parts to the servile masses, who would tear apart the bodies and feast upon the flesh. She has been referred to as Jezebel of the Woeful Destinies. Another prominent figure of black magic rose to power during this time, the magician Orhuarpa. It is said that he had such a strong will that he could physically manifest any image he created in his mind. He used this power to create vicious monstrosities out of the aether that would do his bidding. He sustained them by feeding them his blood. Some sources indicate that these creatures were referred to as chimeras. They also suggest that Orhuarpa was not the only black magician with this power, and that in addition to fighting battles, these chimera were also used as sex slaves. Others still would worship these vampire-like entities. Some of these creations survived the flood, and have lived off human blood up until modern times, becoming the subjects of myth and urban legends. Orhuarpa declared all-out war on other states within Atlantis, sparking wars between white and black magicians. During the day, he would don metal armor and a sword to fight. At night, he would send his wolf-like monstrosities to attack. This is how Orhuarpa fought against other cities and peoples on Atlantis, and even took down the city of the White Master Moria. In this manner, Orhuarpa became the Emperor of Atlantis until he was slain by Master Moria's reincarnation. Battles between white and black magicians raged across Atlantis until it sank into the Atlantic Ocean. The white magicians telepathically warned their disciples of the oncoming cataclysm, so many fled the island by boat or airship. This is the origin of the story of Noah's Ark, the flooding of Gilgamesh, the Hindu legend of Manu, as well as many other flood myths. While primarily white magicians were the ones to escape from the sinking Atlantis, plenty of black magicians escaped to the modern Americas. Voodoo dolls are a practice that originates from Atlantis. Black magicians use the doll to focus mental energy into wishing harm upon their enemies. Aztec sacrificial ceremonies also fall under this category of practices passed down from Atlantis. While the survivors of the sunken continent fled to all the remaining corners of the world, many reached the Americas due to its proximity. All native tribes that existed in the Americas are descendants of the white and black magicians of Atlantis.